And our next speaker will bring us some practice of his own from his experience, which he has a lot of, because our next speaker is Terrence Gargiulo, president of makingstories.net. He has been working with stories across many organizations and has been a chief story officer at Accenture, where he applied stories across the organization. And now we are in for the talk that's called Chiefly Speaking, Tales of a Renegade Storyteller from the Executive Suite. So I believe this is going to be as practical as always, because Terrence is not a first-time speaker at this conference. Terrence, I'm waiting for you live, and I'm ready to pass the mic to you. Yay, welcome. Lovely to see you.
Am I live? Oh, it's wonderful to see you at all times of the day. To those who are in Russia and all over the world, a warm welcome. It's early and foggy here in Monterey.
Welcome. Have a great morning with us. Let me know when you need the slides. We're here for you. Okay. Let's have some fires for Terrence.
Let's get right into it. So it truly is a joy to be with everyone today, and recognizing that I've sat in this role of chief storyteller. So it's a unique, and I don't know if I'm seeing my slides yet, Arden. You can put up the very first slide. Okay, thank you. So I've been in this role of chief storyteller, and so I'd like to kind of share a little bit of that journey. How did I get to that role, and what did I do in that role? What did I learn? What is applicable? And kind of end with what I think are 5 key things that if anyone is interested in doing the type of role of a quote unquote chief storyteller, and I know there's already been a lot of discussion. Is there really such a thing? Why does it tend to be just marketing or training? What can it look like? What is the capacity? So I will share my experience and what we were able to do at Accenture, but we have to kind of set our compass straight. I really think it's important that we start with our true north, and our true north begins with our own origin stories. So I'm going to ask, I frequently do this, which is sometimes you have to go a little storied to get to the story. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about where my true north began and how that led me to Accenture and how that guided the work that I do at Accenture. And most importantly, leave you with 5 key things that relate to how you might guide your own journey towards these things. So it all began as a child. This is my father. Everyone can say buongiorno, Maestro Luigi Taddeo Gargiulo, and Dad was a conductor and a composer. And in a form, that really is a musician. That really is a magician. What Dad was able to do, I marveled as a child as I sat in the audience and I watched how just with his baton, he could communicate so much. He could bring alive the music. He could help people connect to abstractions on a page. He could inspire musicians that had their own gifts and talents. People in organizations have gifts and talents. They have experiences. They have expertise. So Dad, through this work as a conductor, was able to then touch an audience. But it wasn't him that directly was doing it. It was all about how he facilitated that process. And as a child, I marveled and I wondered, what was this gift of communication? Now, if Dad was a conductor, I'm sure you can all maybe make a guess as to who this beautiful woman is, who died 2 years ago. This is Gloria, and yes, she is my mother. And she was a singer. And likewise, as I began to try to find my true north as a child, and I watched the examples of my parents, my mother had this beautiful gift, not only as an artist, of bringing alive words, such that the words became a story, It drew people into an emotional experience. It drew people into a place where they had associations because they could see the care and the intentionality with which each word she sang, how she sang each phrase. And furthermore, I watched her also help others in choirs sing. And that as well was a form of magic and connection that truly touched me as a child and began to point me towards my own true north. Now, if mom and dad were, in the arts, then of course at some point I was going to myself dabble in the arts. And this brought me to my first child professional experience as a boy soprano. And there's an opera by an American composer, Italian-American composer, Giancarlo Menotti. And the opera is Amal and the Night Visitors. And the character, you can see me there on the right of the slide. That was me, I think about 10 years old, if I'm remembering correctly. And as a 10-year-old, I sang this role. And Amal, in the story, Amal is a crippled boy. And he lives with his widowed mother, and they are very poor, and they have nothing. And the story takes place in the quote unquote kind of Christmas season. And Amal is outside looking at the stars, and suddenly the three kings, and the story of the three kings are that the Christ child was visited by these royal kings that were bringing the Christ child three gifts: gold, incense, and myrrh. And in the story, the kings stop in Amal's village. Now the mother is desperate. They're going to run out of money and she's going to have to go begging. And during the night, the kings ask if they can stay in with Amal and his mother, and the villagers bring them gifts. And then during the night, when everyone is asleep, the mother sees all that gold that's going to be brought to the child. And she sings, "Oh, if I just had a piece of that gold, one piece for my child, for my child, for my child." Thief! She takes a piece of gold, and the kings wake up and they call her a thief. And then they explain to her that this child doesn't need this gold. And Amal, the mother, says, "Oh, how I wish I had a gift of my own to give to this child." And Amal, and here I am, this 10-year-old boy, I'm playing this part of being the crippled boy, and I sing, "But mother, let me give him my crutch. Who knows, he may need one, and this I made myself." "But you can't," she says. And Amal takes the crutch, and without realizing it, hands it to the king and says, "I walk, mother." So every night on that stage, I felt that miracle of being healed. I had the peak experience of no longer being Terrence, but actually being this character of Amal and being touched by healing. Another part of my origin story about my true north, and your true north is going to be very important in terms of how you show up as a chief storyteller. I have two more pieces to this story. I also, at a young age, became a competitive fencer. And here I am with my first fencing coach. And fencing brought me to another interesting place. So I saw a father that was connecting with audiences. I saw my mother's artistry. I felt what it was like to step so deeply into a story as a performer that I lost all sense of myself, and something bigger and more powerful was happening to me. And then as an athlete, I became a very successful fencer, competed for the US and US junior national champion and alternate for the Olympics and all this sort of thing, and traveled to Russia. Actually, my first junior world championship in 1984 was in Leningrad. And anyway, fencing brought me to peak performance. So if Amal, and as a 10-year-old child, I had experienced peak experience, The fencing brought me to peak performance, everything in myself operating at its fullness. All these experiences were making me question reality and question how do we operate in this world. So I want to bring you to the last piece of this origin story, and I promise you we're going to get to all the specificity of my role as a chief storyteller. But in college, this gentleman, Professor Louis Iglesias, or Uncle Lulu, as I love to call him, and this is a picture of him at my wedding, and he's reciting a poem. And this picture, he had 3 months earlier suffered 3 brain aneurysms and some other complications, and yet this brilliant man was, you couldn't shut him down. Nothing was going to stop him. But when I walked into my freshman great books course, it was a humanities course, and this odd professor, and I did not want to be in this classroom, but this odd professor shows up. He's wearing rainbow suspenders, and he walks up to the front of the room, and I was in the back of the room because I wanted to get out of there as quickly as I could. And without saying a word, he takes this book on the left-hand side. It's a book by an American author called The Giving Tree. And the short of the book is, it's a little story about a boy and a tree, and how throughout the life of the boy, the tree keeps giving. So as a child, you can see it's dropping an apple for the boy. It gives him a place to play. When he becomes married, it offers some of its branches so the boy can build a house. And even when he's an old man and the tree is almost nothing and the tree is cut down, the little boy can sit on the stump. He's no longer a little boy, but an old man. Professor Iglesias read this very popular story, and you could hear in the room a sigh. We all remembered mommy or daddy or auntie or whoever reading that story to us. Now, without saying a word, Professor Iglesias opened up the book and read the story again. And suddenly, this sweet story that we all remembered, the association we had, now became something altogether different. Why this boy, maybe he was a narcissist. Maybe this boy was like we are with how we abuse our planet, how we're poor stewards of all the beautiful gifts that we have of nature and air and all these things. And so we became very angry and incensed to realize that this innocent story that was such a part of our lives meant something else. But in actuality, Professor Luis Iglesias was neither asking us to see the story in one way or another. He was asking us to imagine who and how we are. And at that point, my compass locked in. And I realized that stories, sense-making, sense-giving, was a way of understanding the journey that I was on, and in fact would point me towards the future work that I would do. Now, life goes on, and I went in and published 10 books, and had one of the first books in 2001, along with another wonderful writer, Steve Denning. And then, of course, there was a work by a lawyer a little bit before that, but I was one of the early books on organizational storytelling, and that launched my practice, my boutique practice. Well, let's forward all of that and let's go to roughly, around 2014. And around 2014, I had begun to work a lot with clients around change. There seemed to be an appetite for approaching change management. And I think it's just because technology was, of course, moving very, very, very quickly. We had gone past client server, and we were moving into all of these web-based architectures, and everybody was updating their systems and their processes. And along the way, people were also recognizing that when you do some of that, especially at the scale that many companies were doing, that it does affect people. It actually affects culture. And so I had finished a big project with Visa and had been approached by Accenture, and they said, we have this problem. We have this West Coast practice. where we're doing change management. And we realize it's now affecting people and culture in more ways than here's how the new process works. Here's the buttons of how you work with the system and get everybody up to speed so that we can all adopt this new system. So they realized that something more had to be done, and they wanted my bag of tricks. And I said, okay, that sounds good. I tell you what, I've always wanted to scale my work. One of the things I know my colleagues can really resonate with this when I say this. Sometimes as storytellers, we're a little bit like lone wolves. You know, we don't necessarily get the opportunity to scale the work. We do big projects and we go in with big companies, yeah, but scaling our work is something that I know all of us want to do. You just heard, you know, David and his colleague, and they're doing some marvelous work around narrative intelligence and how to build that capacity in the organization. So this is work that we're really passionate about. So I signed up and said yes. Now the problem was that Accenture, which is a global system integrator, at the time that I began with them, they were about 500,000. I think today they're over 700,000 in over 120 countries throughout the world. So it gives you a sense of the scale. And they're also a professional service company. So professional service companies, you know, are odd beasts. They have a particular way of running. So I want to even preface my experience as chief storyteller was unique to that environment. And we did quite a number of very interesting things that I'm about ready to take you through. How I got there was I actually, after about a year, and I had done projects for Salesforce and Google and Facebook, but you know what? It all turned out that all they were still interested in was basic enterprise resource planning systems. It was the same old stuff. They really weren't ready to actually touch the cultural piece and do true digital transformation that required the story work. So I was ready to leave Accenture. Now, at the time, I was doing some community practice type calls, and people knew about my bag of tricks of storytelling. And there was a senior managing director, a very high leader in the company, and he had written a blog post on storytelling and sales. And actually, a junior analyst who had attended one of my sessions wrote him. I didn't even know about this particular, blog post that he had put out there. Wrote to Lee Moore and said, "Hey Lee, you got to talk to this guy. He's really passionate about storytelling. Maybe he has more of what you're talking about in this blog post." Well, Lee and I spoke, and to make the story short, he said, "You're crazy." Because I turned to him and said, the problem he was having, let me back it up. The problem he was having was they weren't able to sell the $100 million plus sales. And why weren't they able to do it? Not because they weren't great salespeople, but because they didn't know how to co-create. They didn't know how to engage with the client. They didn't know how to elicit the stories and build a story with companies, with a CEO. If a CEO is going to sell a $100 million project, it's not just them signing on the dotted line. They've got to bring along a board. They've got to bring along the whole organization. They have to co-create a vision, and they have to have a way of telling that story. So I was vetted, and he said, "You're crazy, but I think you're onto something. Show my guys and gals new tricks. Show them how they can engage with customers in a fundamentally new way, because we need to move the needle on our sales." I said, "Okay, Lee, but I need two things from you. I need two things. One, I need the number taken off of my head." And when I say number in consulting, we are tasked to be utilized a certain percent of the time. So it means you have to be billable. So I had a 70% number on my head. It means that if I didn't deliver 70% of my time at the company, wasn't billed to a client, then I wasn't performing. So that was the metric I was held to. I said, "Lee, some of my work is going to be internal, some of it's going to be external. I want that number off my head." And he said, "Okay." And I said, "I need one other thing. I need you to ensure that my hand is not on the honeypot. And what I mean by the honeypot is, if a $100 million deal was sold, if the partners, and since it's a public company, they're called managing directors and senior managing directors. If the partners think that I am going to benefit from the sale, they're not going to listen to me. So in order for me to be able to ask them to do completely different things and show up in a new way, my hand has to be off the honeypot. They have to know I'm not going to make $1 from the deal. You and I will work out a different way to do the bonus structure. He said yes. Now, it hadn't even been a day into the job, and I had this guy come to me, and a senior managing director. They were working with an account, and it was a very large account, and all he had been trying to do for the last quarter was increase that particular workflow. Workflow just means that they had multiple projects going on at this big client, and all he wanted to do was expand one of the projects, and he was getting nowhere. And I said, well, show me, A, tell me who you were talking to, and B, show me what you're trying to do and what you gave to them. And he goes, here's what we're doing. It's really simple. All we're trying to do is change this workflow, give them some automation, and give them a better way to manage their digital assets. It's part of their whole digital advertising solution that they had. And I said, this is what you showed them, and you had a chief marketing officer in the room, and you had senior leaders in the room. I said, no wonder they couldn't understand, just from a basic workflow. That doesn't tell a compelling story. I said, try something like this. And what we did is, in just a few minutes, we mocked up actually what the value of what they were doing, and made it into a fun story, and gave them a clear leave behind piece. I mean, consider if that's your leave behind piece, meaning what you use to socialize the work that you want to do, or something like this is your leave behind piece, it changes altogether. So then we began to roll out. Now, keep in mind that as a chief storyteller for all of North America, I did not have a direct budget. And at the time, I was parked into sales, a quote unquote sales enablement role, since a huge part of what they were doing was these transformational sales. So we framed the work in these three kind of broad areas. One was about facilitating. This was about doing discovery with clients. This was about sitting down with account teams that were looking to expand and having them truly understand the experiences of people in the organization so that new solutions could be imagined. There certainly was the coaching and development. And in a second, I'll talk to you a little bit about a master class. In fact, I had the joy of working with David Hutchins. We brought David Hutchins in to help with that, to scale that global masterclass that we did. And I was also working as a solution architect, which was helping to translate offerings and solutions into stories, and helping them to map those into customer stories. And all of this was leading to the end game. My end game was the following, and we did get there, which was, if you brought money into the firm, they were going to then be willing to allow for the creation of a true organizational development, storytelling practice. And that's what we were driving towards, which was to build an actual practice in the firm that went out externally and actually built that narrative intelligence, built that capability across all dimensions of the organization. So that was kind of the end game. We were very, very successful. It became really throughout the whole organization. It was an interesting time. They were moving away from laddering, and the laddering system was, if you're not hitting your 70%, then you were going to be cut from the organization, and they were trying to make the organization a more human place. One want to share a couple of quick stories of impact. It was one of the first groups I was sitting with, and they were all creating for Pfizer a new ecosystem of digital offerings so that various people that are affected by cancer, from the patient to the people who support the patient to nurses, whatnot, all were kind of coming into this centralized hub. And I was listening to their presentation, and I realized that they had no connection whatsoever. And I said, this is really simple, guys. Have you all known someone with cancer? And they said, yeah. Have you known people with breast cancer? Yes. Okay. So relate what you're doing to the people. Relate your story, your experience, be human, and in the process, show how the things that you were doing, for example, your neighbor needed to know what healthy foods they could eat as they were going through their cancer treatments. And you didn't know what those healthy foods were either. And you had to research those and find out about those. And hey, that's something that your digital ecosystem is going to do. So they ended up all wearing pink shirts. They all had like these stories, and suddenly they were engaged with the customers, and the customer was engaged with them. Artem, I'm just checking in. What's our stop time before we get to questions? I'm realizing that I don't necessarily know that, and I want to make sure I hit a couple of key slides. Oh, I'm not sure if I'm hearing Artem. Okay, let me just keep going. Oh yeah, Artem, just so I'm
we've got 3 minutes till questions, but we can, we can go 5. And
okay, I'm going to skip to a couple of things. Let me try to skip. Let me skip to some of the key assets that we developed as we launched this. So we started with kind of a very simple framework, which is understanding that stories inform, connect, and emote. And we took that and then said, all right, if we're going to work with account teams, and customers, we need to apply this inform. Stories help us to inform, they help us connect, they help us to emote. And then we need to look at those across these four areas. We need to be able to come with our stories. We need to be able to come with an understanding of the company's stories. We need to be able to build case stories that are that allow us to give people a sense of what it's like to work with us. What we needed to sell was the experience of working with us so that our customers could imagine it. And lastly, we needed to really have a lot of intelligence around the client stories. So this was kind of this framework, and then helping them to work in these areas. We then also brought my story-based communication skills competency model. This was what we then based how we developed the narrative intelligence. This was given the Asia Pacific Human Resource Leadership Award for the work that I did in studying what are story-based communication skills and how are they developed. We did a lot of work around eliciting and helping see the opportunities to stand in the shoes of our clients. Now, as I said, we developed this storytelling masterclass. We had 50, we had people that wanted to join our team. In fact, this was part of the lessons learned that I may not get a chance to truly get into the details of, but we actually lost people along the way. People became so excited about storytelling. And as I said, everyone had a number on their head, even managing directors. And some people got so into wanting to be one of our enabling story coaches that they let their number drop because they couldn't bill for the story work that they were doing inside the client, because at the time there wasn't a lot of charge codes that could be applied because we were still sort of rolling out storytelling as a billable practice. We had some charge codes, but not a lot. But as we rolled out this master class globally, this was one of the key offerings that we had. Worked with, as I said, David Hutchins and Karen Dietz. We thought we were going to be able to pull her in for a little bit, so she was there for a bit. So that was really exciting. There you can see this was the first master class that David and I did in India when we launched this whole effort, and it was at the Ritz-Carlton, so it was quite a wonderful experience, and that was just the beginning of an explosion of this work. I did do quite a bit of work with external clients that was specifically building the story practice, and this example was with Nokia. We had a 6-month engagement with Nokia. They were trying to relaunch their strategic vision, and in preparation for holding a 3-day offsite with the executive suite, C-suite individuals and parts of their team, we gathered stories throughout Nokia so that they could truly understand. This picture is actually them at the beginning of the workshop that I was facilitating, of them listening to the stories that we had gathered. So we took the stories, we themed them, we recorded them, and then I wanted them to listen to the voices of their folks and listen to the stories before they even began thinking strategically. They were even given headsets and eye patches for those who wanted to wear it. So you can see one guy there wearing the head patch. I'm going to just touch on 2 last things, Artem, before we get to questions. Another big work that we did was, at the time, Bangalore was relaunching its innovation center. And as part of that, they recognized that when people came for tours, and what would happen at this innovation center is teams of people from a company, let's say 30, 20 people, would come and visit the innovation center, and they would get this grand tour of what the capabilities, what cutting edge things were happening in their industry and whatnot. And so we worked with them over the course of a year, again, in helping to craft those stories and the experiences that people had when they walked into this innovation center. That was really incredible, just to then see the difference in customers' experiences when the whole thing was built as a story, not just the stories of the individuals and how they talked about the technologies, but actually the experience of being in the innovation center was all architected. And that was work that we did that was truly rewarding, and again, begins to show story operating in these different ways. This was just a fun, this is not the actual picture of the guy, but it was one of the discovery stories, but I won't go into that now. I'm not going to go through this. This shows the maturity, though, of storytelling at Accenture as it related to these MDs, where we began to, when I had the 50 storytelling coaches that were all kind of matrixed into me, we were sitting with deal teams and we were crafting, this was visually like, how are we going to tell the story? They began thinking about metaphor and about how to bring alive very complex processes and how to also do that visually, how to then bring alive the value proposition of the solutions, and to do that from the various stakeholders' points of view. And so these were just some examples of those assets that began to be developed that reflected that storytelling work was truly, kind of landing in the organization. So I'm gonna end here, and I want to just share with you these 4 key things to take away for anyone who's interested in deep storytelling work and becoming kind of a storytelling leader, a chief storytelling. I began with all of those origin stories because really you have to know yourself and be yourself. if you show up as a chief storyteller and all you have is a bag of tricks, all you're trying to do is manipulate, you're not authentic, you don't have an intentionality of, as David and his colleague were talking about, connecting people, you're not going to be an effective chief storytelling officer. You might be an effective marketer, you might be an effective communication person, you might be effective a lot of things. It's truly about the quality of person who you are. I hate to be so soft and fuzzy about it. And I'm not trying to say that I'm this beautiful, wonderful person, but I try to be. But it's truly about the quality of who you are. You need to also serve as a facilitating strategist who is constrained by your exigencies. So my exigencies were, I had to move the needle for sales, but in the process, I was touching Accenture culturally throughout, and we were doing lots of things. And in fact, one of the reasons I left was that we were almost too successful. And that's maybe a story for another time, or maybe it could come up in the Q&A. I'd be happy to kind of talk about that. But you need to be intent on lifting up the value of others and the mission of the organization. You need to also be a chameleon, a benevolent trickster who is constantly reinventing himself or herself and negotiating its purpose and focus in the organization. So as you can see, even from my just quick trying to touch upon my experience, I was constantly changing. Even though I was doing sales, I was doing strategy work at Nokia and suddenly showing that we had a practice. We were also building software to actually create a platform. I think that was this final, it's not there. Oh yeah, we're actually even building a platform for storytelling that at the time was using stuff that now is very much a part of AI, but at the time wasn't. And lastly, you need to be able to speak the language of stories. Measure and socialize the impact of your work with stories. So I'm going to stop there, Artem. I know we just barely have probably 2 minutes. So let me have it.
Thank you for this review of your journey. And I love to see familiar faces that you have accompanied you in this, and how many different ways were there. Being conscious of the time, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. One from Michelle, one from Alexis about being too successful. If you're comfortable with it, I would love you to stay and maybe reply there. But before I let you go, a traditional question, and we can take our time on this. So you've just shown us that story can be applied in many different ways. But if there was only one way you could choose to apply story, what would that way be? And why, of course?
Giving a new face to innovation and allowing the value of individuals to imagine possibilities. So as we move into a world of greater and greater automation, as we leverage these ubiquitous tools, and that's what all they are, but as we leverage AI and determine what role it's going to have, how are people working with each other to imagine new possibilities and to imagine themselves as having a starring role, and doing that kind of deep story finding, story collaborating, story inventing, so that everyone holds their personal value and brings that personal value to a mission value for the organization.
Love it. Giving a new face to the innovation and imagining new possibilities. Love the reply. And given the organizations you've just walked us through, the connection to innovation is great. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful journey and a very expressive one. Let's have our fires burning for Terrence. And
thank you.
Please stay if you're comfortable to reply in the chat. That would be great.
Sure, will do.